What's rhetoric good for? Well, quite a lot actually. Hey, good to see you. Not long ago, we were talking about Aristotle's rhetoric and about the way that he was responding to common criticisms that rhetoric was a cheap, manipulative counterfeit of philosophy. But Aristotle recognized that rhetoric had its own value separate from philosophy, and he spent a good amount of time discussing rhetoric's unique usefulness. In that last video, we talked mostly about the differences between rhetoric and philosophical dialectic, and we discussed how those differences mostly arise from the fact that rhetoric was meant to be used among citizens in a democratic process, and dialectic is meant to be used among expert philosophers. Today, though, I want to spend some more time talking about the things that rhetoric can do better than philosophy or anything else, and that's in part so that we can understand Aristotle's rhetoric better, but it's mostly because people still criticize rhetoric as being somehow underhanded or illegitimate. But the reality is that rhetoric is really valuable and that we do ourselves a disservice when we just dismiss it. So let's get into it and see how Aristotle explained it. Near the beginning of the Rhetoric, Aristotle lays out 4 key reasons that rhetoric is useful, and outlining the first, he says, rhetoric is useful because things that are true and things that are just have a natural tendency to prevail over their opposites. If you remember from our last video, we mentioned that rhetoric isn't as concerned about finding absolute truth as philosophy is. Where philosophy works according to strict logical sequences, rhetoric operates on probabilities. If something is most likely true, that's good enough for the rhetorician. But that makes people like those ancient philosophers pretty uncomfortable. See, when your mission is to find absolute truth, you might think people aren't taking things seriously enough when they're settling for something that's most likely true. In fact, you might even say that it's dangerous. If you're only 90% sure that you're right, there's a 10% chance that you could be wrong, and what do you do then? Aristotle has confidence that the truth will always be easier to defend than a lie. Over time, even if we don't know what's true at first, it will eventually become impossible to defend a false proposition. So I could make a pretty convincing argument that I was wearing an orange tie right now. I could talk about how I thought it went with the other things that I was wearing. I could mention how other people said that it reminded them of pumpkins and tangerines. I could even show you some pictures of me in an orange tie. But over time, those arguments, no matter how artful and moving, may become less and less convincing. As we spend more time talking about my tie and working through the questions, the arguments that my tie is orange may become less and less persuasive. And in a similar sense, it has become increasingly difficult to make persuasive arguments that the Earth is in the center of the solar system, or that you could turn lead into gold, because as we learn more and more, the evidence just won't support a false conclusion. This understanding is the foundation of Aristotle's case for rhetoric. I see him essentially saying that the truth will take care of itself with or without our help, so we don't need to become overly concerned about the 10 or 2% chance that we might be wrong. As long as we keep learning and debating, we'll figure out what's true, because it's a lot easier to prove the truth than to prove a lie. Now, you may not be convinced that it's okay to trust that the truth will work itself out, and you may still think that all this persuasion business is still just a distraction from the deep down serious truth. Sure, rhetoric is fine, I guess, if you don't have a better way to figure out what's true, but don't we have better ways? According to the philosophers, at least, that better way is dialectics. So why spend all the time with emotions and speeches and things that are probably true when we could just figure out what is true and publish that? Well, Aristotle recognized that the truth by itself isn't always enough. He said, moreover, before some audiences, not even the possession of the exactest knowledge will make it easy for what we say to produce conviction. For argument based on knowledge implies instruction, and there are people whom one cannot instruct. Here then, we must use as our modes of persuasion and argument notions possessed by everybody when dealing with the way to handle a popular audience. That is, even if you have the 100% absolute philosophical truth about something, there are still some people who might resist it. The truth does have a tendency to win out in the end, but that doesn't mean that it's always convincing by itself. For example, Aristotle had an empirical understanding that the Earth was spherical, but even today there are some people with reservations about that fact. So Aristotle points out that even when you have the truth, you may still need to persuade people that you do in fact have the truth. and this is especially important in contexts where you're not working with people who are experts. I've spent a lot of time around academics and other people who might be called experts, and I've observed a common pattern among them. A. Experts decide that something is true and that society should do what they say. B. The truth gets communicated to the general public. C. People question, challenge, or ignore the truth as presented by the experts. And D. Experts get fussy and lament the public's rejection of the facts. Now, I don't see this as a failure of science or of the education system or anything like that. At its core, this is a rhetorical failure. So-called experts find some truth and then just announce it without showing people where it comes from, why it matters, or how it could benefit them. And then they act surprised and indignant when nobody seems to care. So if I were to translate Aristotle's idea today, I might say, dear experts, you can't just come down from the ivory tower with your lab results and expect everybody to appreciate what you found. If you want people to put the truth to work, you're going to have to get them to care enough to do it. In other words, you can't just announce the facts, you need to persuade people to use them well. Yes, it's easier to persuade people of the truth than of a lie, but that doesn't mean that the truth is always very persuasive by itself. So rhetoric is useful because it makes it easier for us to adhere to the truth once we've found it. So after those first 2 points, Aristotle goes on to explain how rhetoric works to detect truth and to combat falsehoods. He explains, we must be able to employ persuasion, just as strict reasoning can be employed, on opposite sides of a question. Not in order that we may in practice deploy it in both ways, for we must not make people believe what is wrong, but in order that we may see clearly what the facts are, and that if another man argues unfairly, we on our part may be able to confute him. As we talked about in the last video, both rhetoric and dialectic work by considering opposite sides of an issue. So I don't really think that Aristotle's original audience would have had any complaints about that idea. But I have seen that people now are especially uncomfortable with the idea of considering both sides of an issue, and I think in part that comes from an inaccurate understanding of what counts as true. To clarify, we know first that rhetoric operates on probabilities, so we persuade somebody to do something because that action will most likely lead to a desired outcome. Rhetoric doesn't work in the realm of certainty, and that's because certainty is hard to come by. Whether it be because of limitations in time, knowledge, tools, skills, or something else, it's very rare to be 100% sure of anything. Remember, even the sciences, which we often hold up as foundational sources of truth, use probability and statistics to validate their claims. So science doesn't produce 100% certainty, but it does produce very high likelihoods, high enough that we can rely on it with confidence. And rhetoric is comfortable with the reality that it's practically impossible to know anything with absolute certainty. There's always room for a little bit of error. So considering both sides of an issue is essential because there's always a chance, even if it's a very small one, that we might be wrong. When we make sure to really understand an opposing idea in the way that someone on the other side does, then we're in the best position to see the relative strengths and limitations of both arguments. One of the things that I appreciate so much about rhetoric is that it requires us to accept the potential that we could be wrong. So we consider arguments seriously, not because we endorse them or agree with them, but because we owe it to ourselves to make sure that our position is actually correct. So even if we think there's a 99% chance that we're right, it's still worth running the 1% simulation to be sure. And there's another benefit to considering both sides of an issue and letting ideas go up against one another. When you only stick with your side, then all you know is that your ideas sound good to you. But when you weigh your ideas against another perspective, even if you don't end up changing your mind, then you know with a lot greater confidence that your position is superior to another one. So by considering both sides thoroughly and rigorously, we protect ourselves from the risk of being wrong and simultaneously give ourselves a chance to confirm the validity of our arguments. I could go on about the importance of taking opposing arguments seriously, and I'm sure I will in the future, but for now, I'll just say that we can have greater confidence in our own convictions and an increased ability to cooperate productively with others when we put in the work to understand how the other side thinks. And again, taking both sides seriously does not mean advocating for false or dangerous ideas. As Aristotle reminds his audience, things that are true and things that are better are, by their nature, practically always easier to prove and easier to believe in. At its most basic, rhetoric suffers from the undeserved reputation that it is a tool of manipulation and deceit. And I'll be frank, rhetoric can be used in deceitful and manipulative ways, but that does not mean that rhetoric is itself manipulative. Aristotle says that it's absurd to say that we can defend ourselves from physical attacks with our physical strength, but that we can't defend ourselves from verbal attacks with our words. In other words, there are bad actors out there who will use rhetoric nefariously, and our best defense is to use rhetoric in turn for good. So if we accept that the truth is ultimately more persuasive than a falsehood, then we also need to recognize that a liar will have to resort to the most careful and convincing persuasive arguments in order to sell their lies. If we just leave the truth by itself, understanding that the truth by itself is not always immediately persuasive, then the liar could convince everyone that something that is false is the truth because they're presenting it more persuasively. But if we know how both sides of the issue work and we can see the flaws in the liar's arguments, then we'll be in a great position to present a clear and convincing rebuttal to their lies. So if we refuse to learn rhetoric, we'll be at the mercy of those who will misuse it. If we master it, though, we'll be in the best position to refute lies and to promote the truth among all kinds of audiences. For thousands of years, rhetoric has been dismissed and derided as a tool for swindlers and politicians, but always by people who misunderstand its fundamental purpose and value. Aristotle said it then, and I'll say it now. Rhetoric is our best tool for dealing with uncertainty, discovering useful truths, checking our biases, and challenging lies. Nothing even comes close, because that's exactly what rhetoric was designed to do. The more I observe the current state of things, the more I'm persuaded that we all just need a healthy dose of rhetorical training. That way we can relate to each other as human beings and get to work on things that matter, instead of just shouting at each other all the time. But what do I know? I guess if you won't hear it from me, you can hear it from Aristotle. And believe me, there's more of Aristotle's rhetoric in our shared future, so I hope you'll stick around. In the meantime, though, let me know what thoughts or questions you have, and I'll see you around.